Gacha games have a reputation for terrible storytelling, messy plots, too many characters, and stories that feel like they're constantly being interrupted by the next banner. If you look around online, you'll see the same criticism appear over and over again, that gacha games simply aren't a good medium for narrative. The stories feel messy, characters constantly appear and disappear, and the plot often feels like it's being pulled in 10 different directions at once. And honestly, if you played enough gacha games, it's not hard to see why people think that. But I don't actually think the problem is the medium itself. In fact, I think gacha games might be one of the most interesting storytelling formats we've seen in games in a long time. The real issue is something else. Most gacha stories aren't written for the gacha format, they're written like traditional RPG stories, and then forced into a structure that works very differently. And when that happens, the narrative starts to fragment. The story gets split between main chapters, character stories, side events, banner introductions, and seasonal updates, until eventually it stops feeling like one cohesive narrative and starts feeling like a collection of disconnected pieces. But the interesting thing is that this doesn't always happen. There are a few gacha games that actually manage to make this structure work surprisingly well. And when you look at how they do it, something becomes very clear. The problem isn't that gacha games are bad for storytelling. The problem is that we're still trying to tell the wrong kind of stories with them. So today I want to talk about why gacha narratives so often feel fragmented and what happens when a story is actually written for the medium instead of fighting against it. One of the most common criticism you hear about gacha games is that the stories just don't work very well. And to be fair, if you've played enough of them, it's not hard to understand why people feel that way. A lot of gacha narratives can feel strangely messy. The story jumps between different arcs, new characters appear constantly, and the plot often feels like it's being pulled into multiple directions at the same time. Sometimes a major conflict is building momentum, and then the next update suddenly shifts to focus somewhere else entirely. A new character appears, they get a dramatic introduction, a few important scenes, and then almost immediately the narrative moves on. You can see this kind of thing happen quite often in live service storytelling. For example, in Wuthering Waves, when the character Chisa was introduced, it happened during the interlude between the 2.x storyline and the transition into the 3.x arc. The game spent time setting up her character and giving her a noticeable presence in the narrative. But once the story moved into the next major arc, she almost immediately faded into the background. She didn't disappear completely, but her role in the narrative became extremely small compared to the way she was introduced. And when things like this happen repeatedly, the story can start to feel unstable, almost like the narrative is constantly shifting its focus rather than developing a consistent cast of characters. Because of that, many players have come to a fairly straightforward conclusion: that the gacha format itself simply isn't a good structure for storytelling. The argument usually goes something like this: gacha games are built around character banners, and new characters need to be introduced regularly so that players can become attached to them. Which means the story constantly needs to find ways to bring those characters into the narrative, and when that happens often enough, the plot can start revolving around characters' introductions rather than around the story itself. A major arc begins, then a new character needs to be introduced, so the narrative finds a way to involve them, even if their role in the larger narrative is relatively small. From this perspective, it's easy to see why many people believe that gacha storytelling is fundamentally constrained by its structure. The format encourages the narrative to constantly expand its cast of characters, and that expansion can make the story feel diluted. Another criticism you often hear is that gacha stories tend to focus too heavily on characters instead of plot. Instead of building a tightly structured narrative, the writing often revolves around introducing new personalities, new backstories, and new character interactions. And for some players, that's another sign that the medium itself isn't suited for strong storytelling. But the more I started thinking about these criticisms, the more I realized that something about them didn't quite add up. Because none of these elements are inherently bad for storytelling. Stories built around large cast of characters exist in many other mediums. Long-running television series introduce new characters over time all the time, and character-driven narratives can often be far more compelling than purely plot-driven ones. So if these same storytelling elements exist in other mediums without completely breaking the narrative, then maybe the problem isn't the gacha format itself, maybe the real issue lies somewhere else. After looking at these criticisms, I started to suspect that the problem might not actually be the gacha format itself, because none of the things people usually blame are inherently bad for storytelling. Large cast of characters aren't unusual. Long-running stories introduce new characters all the time, and character-driven narratives can often be far more engaging than strictly plot-driven ones. So if those elements exist in other mediums without breaking the narrative, then maybe the real issue isn't the presence of banners or the expanding roster. Maybe the real issue is how the narrative gets divided across the different parts of the game. What many gacha stories end up suffering from is something I would describe as narrative fragmentation. Instead of feeling like one cohesive story, the narrative gets split across multiple different layers. You have the main story, then you have character stories, side stories, limited time events, interludes, world missions, and all of those narrative pieces exist in the same world, often happening around the same timeline. But instead of reinforcing each other, they often end up pulling the narrative apart. This fragmentation creates a very strange situation for the main story. On one hand, the game often tries to bring a large number of characters into the main narrative, but many of those characters don't actually have major roles to play in the central plot. So the narrative ends up stretching smaller stories of roles across a much larger cast of characters than it really needs. Instead of a focused group of characters carrying the narrative forward, the story constantly shifts its attention between different faces, and that can make the main storyline feel bloated. But at the same time, something else is happening in the background. Many of the elements that actually make characters interesting, their relationships, their personal conflicts, their development, are often pushed outside the main story. Those moments get placed in character episodes, side stories, or optional narrative content. So while the main story includes many characters, it often doesn't include the deeper character dynamics that make those characters meaningful. And when that happens, the main narrative starts to feel strangely hollow. The plot continues moving forward, sometimes over the course of several years of updates, but without those stronger character dynamics inside the main narrative itself, the story can start to feel generic. This is something I noticed very clearly while playing through Arknight's Enfield. I often found the character stories more interesting than the main narrative itself, not because the main story was bad, but because the character-driven elements that could have enriched it were often happening somewhere else. And once you start noticing this pattern, you begin to see it in many gacha games, even in Wuthering Waves, which I actually think has been improving in this area. Earlier parts of the story still follow the familiar pattern of spreading narrative elements across different pieces of content, but the 3.1 storyline started doing something much more interesting. Instead of pushing those character moments outside the main narrative, it began integrating them directly into the story itself. The relationship between A-Mate and the protagonist is one example, but another good example is Luke. His backstory and motivations are introduced within the main storyline itself, even though they're handled in a relatively short segment. Some players actually wanted a full separate character story for him, but in my opinion, integrating that background directly into the main narrative worked better, because it allowed the story to develop the character without pushing important context outside the central storyline. And that's really the core problem with narrative fragmentation. When character development, character dynamics, and world building are constantly pushed into separate narrative spaces, the main story can end up carrying only the bare skeleton of the plot, and a skeleton alone rarely makes for a compelling story. Now, once we start looking at gacha storytelling through this lens, another pattern begins to appear. A lot of gacha narratives seems to be built on two different storytelling philosophies at the same time. On one side, the game itself is naturally structured around characters. Characters are the core of the entire system. They are the units players collect, the personalities players become attached to, and the elements that drive most of the game's emotional engagement. Each character has their own design, their own backstory, their own voice lines, and often their own personal story content. From a narrative perspective, this kind of structure naturally leans toward character-driven storytelling more. Stories where the focus is on personalities, relationships, and how different characters interact with each other inside the world. But at the same time, many gacha games write their main storyline in a completely different way. Instead of focusing on character dynamics, the main narrative is often built like a traditional plot-driven RPG story. There's a central conflict, a major threat, different factions fighting for control, a large world-spanning storyline that progresses from one major arc to the next. And in theory, there's nothing wrong with that structure. Many great stories are plot-driven, but when that kind of narrative structure is placed inside a system that constantly introduces new characters, the two approaches can start working against each other. The plot keeps moving forward, focusing on the central conflict. Meanwhile, the game keeps expanding its roster of characters, and because the main story can't realistically give meaningful development to every new character that appears, those character-focused moments often get pushed somewhere else, into character stories, into side narratives, into optional content outside the main storyline. Which brings us back to the fragmentation we talked about earlier. The game itself is built around characters, but the main story is structured around plot. So the elements that make character interesting get separated from the central narrative, and over time that separation can make the main story feel less personal and less engaging than it could have been. Because even though the world is full of interesting characters, the main storyline often isn't the place where those characters actually get to grow. But interestingly, there are a few gacha games that manage to avoid many of those problems, and one example that really stood out to me is Counterside. Now, Counterside isn't necessarily the most popular gacha game out there, but in terms of storytelling, it does something very interesting. It feels like a story that was written first and then adapted into the gacha structure, rather than the other way around. If you remove the gacha system entirely, the narrative would still function perfectly well as a standalone story. I could imagine reading it as a novel and it would still make sense, and one of the biggest reasons for that is how the game handles its characters. Counterside still has a large roster of characters, just like most gacha games, but the difference is that the game doesn't feel the need to force all of those characters into the main narrative. Instead, the main story focuses on a relatively small group of core characters who actually drive the central conflict. Those characters appear constantly throughout the story, and their roles feel clearly defined within the larger narrative. Meanwhile, many of the other characters exist primarily in side stories. Those stories still expand the world, they still develop characters, they still explore different perspectives within the setting, but they aren't constantly trying to push those characters into the main storyline where they don't necessarily belong. And that makes a huge difference, because the main narrative is able to stay focused on the characters who actually matter to the central conflict. At the same time, the world itself still feels rich and expansive because those other stories exist alongside the main plot. In other words, the different narrative layers reinforce each other instead of fragmenting the story. The main plot stays focused, side stories expand the world, character stories explore individual arcs, and because those layers are allowed to exist separately, the narrative doesn't have to stretch every character across the same storyline. This is exactly the kind of structure that many gacha games struggle with. They often feel the need to give every character at least a small role in the main narrative, even when that role isn't really necessary. But Counterside shows that the story doesn't actually need to work that way. A large cast of characters doesn't have to dilute the main story. As long as the narrative understands which characters belong in the central plot and which ones are better explored somewhere else. So when people say that gacha games simply aren't a good medium for storytelling, I don't really think that's the right conclusion, because the structure itself isn't the problem. In fact, the structure of gacha games might actually offer some very interesting storytelling possibilities. The ability to expand the world over time, introduce new characters gradually, and explore different perspectives throughout side stories and character episodes is something that very few other storytelling mediums can really do in the same way. In theory, that kind of structure could allow for extremely rich narratives, a world that grows over years, characters whose stories unfold gradually, different parts of the narrative exploring different aspects of the same setting. But for that structure to work, the story itself has to be designed around it, and that's where many gacha narratives start to struggle. Instead of embracing that fragmented structure, a lot of games try to force everything back into a traditional main storyline. They try to treat the narrative like a standard RPG plot, while the game itself continues expanding in every direction, and that tension is where many of the storytelling problems begin to appear. Characters are pushed into the main narrative even when the story doesn't really need them. Important character moments get separated from the central plot and placed into side stories, and over time, the main storyline ends up carrying only the skeleton of the narrative while the richer character dynamics are scattered elsewhere. The result is a story that often feels both bloated and hollow at the same time. But when a game understands how to balance those different narrative layers, when it knows which characters belong in the main story and which one are better explored elsewhere, the structure can actually work surprisingly well, because at that point, the different parts of the narrative stop competing with each other and start reinforcing each other instead. And when that happens, the gacha format stops feeling like a limitation, it starts feeling like a storytelling tool, which is why I don't think the real question is whether gacha games are a bad medium for storytelling. The real question is whether we're actually writing stories that are designed for the medium in the first place. Gacha storytelling isn't broken, we're just still figuring out how to use the medium properly. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel and letting me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm also curious to hear your examples. Gacha games where you think the storytelling really works, or games where the narrative struggles with some of the problems we talked about today. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.